This is a presentation addressing movement skills versus capacity in the weight room, where we identify breakdowns in the movement pattern due to either a lack of skill, where improper movement patterns occur due to a lack of technical competency or awareness, or a lack of capacity, where improper movement mechanics occur due to either joint or soft tissue restrictions. Introducing the technical model. The technical model provides a framework to assess an athlete's ability to perform a certain skill. By comparing our athlete to this gold standard blueprint, we can gauge the athlete's technical competency. Also, deviations from the ideal technical model can highlight movement dysfunction, which might predict future injury. This can be a combination of mobility and stability issues, which can identify key areas for future programming. Here are some examples of movement dysfunction in the performance of the back squat. This is an example of a lack of movement capacity as demonstrated by John, who is a trail runner. The capacity deficit was established in his performance of the bodyweight squat. On performance of John's squat, John is unable to maintain an upright position, displaying an excessive forward lean where the shoulders are pushed far in front of the body, coupled with a rounded posture, displaying a suboptimal movement pattern. More importantly, it is very clear John is unable to push his knees forward over his toes, suggesting limited ankle mobility and potentially revealing a cause for the excessive hinging of the trunk. However, when load is applied, there is a drastic improvement in John's squat, where he is able to adopt a more upright posture with the barbell aligned over the middle of the foot throughout the entire lift. Although a much improved effort, John is failing to achieve a full range of movement as the crease of the hip is not descending below the middle of the knee, prompting further investigation. Using the knee-to-wall drill to screen for ankle mobility, a distance was marked at 5 inches away from the wall. Using a bare foot, John was instructed to touch his knee against the wall without the heel popping off the ground. As you can see, both knees failed to touch the wall, indicating a mobility restriction in both ankle joints. The Thomas test was also utilised to screen for hip mobility issues, both in flexion and extension. John was instructed to lay flat on his back with one knee tucked into his chest, whilst the other leg hangs off the bench. A positive test would be if John failed to tuck his knee into his chest, indicating a restriction in hip flexion, and if the other leg fails to hang freely off the bench, indicating restrictions in hip extension. As we can see, John has demonstrated the ability to pull the knee into his chest on both sides, indicating no restrictions in hip flexion. However, the same can't be said for hip extension, as there is tension present as both legs are unable to freely hang from the bench, indicating a positive test for restrictions in hip extension. Based on these findings, what intervention strategies would I utilise to improve John's squat? In my opinion, I don't see the need to modify John's technique. Despite John's restriction in both hip and ankle mobility, he is able to achieve a parallel depth under load. As we can see, John's femur is parallel with the floor at end range without using any compensatory strategies. More importantly, as mentioned earlier, John is able to maintain balance of the bar over his midfoot for the entire lift. Is it a perfect squat? No, not by any means. Is it acceptable? I think so. With literature stating that squatting to a parallel depth being the most common choice for the development of lower body strength, as referenced in the paper in 2024 by Stone et al. Therefore, I feel John's squat is competent enough to proceed without intervention. However, if I were to try to improve John's squat to achieve full range of motion, I would look to microdose a combination of ankle and hip mobility drills into his warm-up to help improve range of movement in those areas. I would also temporarily introduce John to a heel raise squat variation to allow John to express full depth. This is an example of movement breakdown due to a lack of skill. This is Max, a 15-year-old rugby player. Of note, Max has a relatively low training age of less than 6 months. From his initial assessment of his bodyweight squat, Max is able to demonstrate an upright posture throughout and is able to reach adequate depth. Where I feel his skill breaks down is at the feet, where you can see the heels starting to rise up, suggesting uneven weight distribution and balance issues. This continued even when load was applied. One thing I noted was Max's footwear. The soft sole prevalent in most recreational footwear can provide an unstable platform when squatting, so he asked him to remove his shoes and emphasise driving through the heels more. This seemed to clear up his technique and provide a more stable squat. Moving on to the deadlift. Here is Ellis, a marathon runner, believe it or not, about to demonstrate a lack of movement capacity in the deadlift. As we can see, Ellis is able to execute a competent hip hinge pattern using a broomstick, where he is instructed to maintain 3 points of contact, the sacrum, the thoracic spine, and the head, with the broom at all times, therefore ruling out a lack of skill. However, when load is applied, Ellis is unable to express a fully extended thoracic spine position and performs the lift with a slightly flexed upper back, which can then indicate a lack of thoracic mobility or a lack of hamstring mobility, meaning Ellis is unable to sit his hips back in the starting position, prompting investigation into both areas. Using the wall slide to screen for restrictions in thoracic mobility, Ellis is required to stand with his feet 5 inches away from the wall, with his lumbar spine and his head pressed flat into the wall. Ellis is then instructed to slide his arms up and down the wall whilst keeping his elbows and wrists completely flat, without the low back and head lifting off the wall. As you can see, Ellis is failing to keep his wrists flat against the wall, particularly on his right side, therefore suggesting a mobility restriction in his thoracic spine and his ability to externally rotate the shoulders. We then moved on to assessing Ellis's hamstring mobility using the FMS Active Straight Leg Raise, founded by Gray Cook and Lee Burton. Ellis was instructed to lay supine and lift the straight leg as high as possible, scored on a scale of 0 to 3, 3 being the perfect score. As we can see, Ellis scored 1 on both sides as the malleolus on the lifted leg failed to align with the knee joint, indicating a severe restriction in hamstring mobility. However, as I mentioned with my athlete John, despite these mobility deficits, Ellis presents an acceptable deadlift in my opinion. He is able to create initial tension and stability using his legs and his back prior to the lift. When lifting the bar, Ellis's hips and shoulders rise simultaneously and he clears his knees out of the way of the bar, ensuring an efficient bar path. One could argue the rounded back positioning could be deemed unsafe. However, various literature states there isn't a clear relationship between lifting posture and lower back injury. If I were to improve Ellis's deadlift to comply with a traditional technical model of lifting with a neutral spine position, as with John earlier, I would implement specific hamstring and thoracic spine mobility interventions into his warm-up and would substitute the barbell deadlift for the more mechanically advantageous trap bar deadlift variation, where Ellis would find it easier to express these body positions. Here's the final example where we see 800-meter runner Ross perform the deadlift with some technical deficits. As we can see, Ross approaches the bar, displaying a very competent spine position with a clear lumbar curve and extended thoracic spine. However, where I can see technical breakdown is at the positioning of the hips, where Ross is sitting them too low in the starting position and forcing his knees in front of his elbows. This in turn will cause Ross to move the bar around his knees and pulling the bar away from his centre of mass during the initial phase of the lift and creating an inefficient bar path. To correct this, I asked Ross to lift his hips a little higher so that the knees are aligned with the crease of the elbow. This in turn will create a more vertical bar path as the knees are able to clear out of the way of the bar. Technical models in the weight room provide a framework to compare athlete movement competency and identify potential physical weaknesses. However, several aspects need to be considered. Deviations from the ideal technical model are necessary in certain contexts. The tall athlete may have to adopt alternative movement strategies when performing the squat, for example. Adopting a wider stance due to longer femurs or squatting with more of a hip hinge to account for the longer torso. We should also consider the veteran athlete with previous injuries. He or she may have to seek alternative movement strategies to be able to train optimally without aggravation. It should be noted that causes of injury are rarely due to one isolated factor. Excessive training volume and intensity, stress from external factors, poor nutrition and sleep strategies can all combine to increase the athlete's risk of injury. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that an athlete displaying a degree of movement dysfunction is at higher risk of injury based on that one factor. I hope you found this informative. Thank you for listening.